No, but like he's got like incredible what toad. He's annoying, and you don't want to drop like on all the building.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. As you know, my name is Dr. Bart. I'm an associate professor of history and interdisciplinary studies here at Kennesaw State. And this is the Atlantic World class, Atlantic History class. Today we have a special treat today. We have Professor Randal Maurice Jelks visiting from the University of Kansas from the African American Studies Department there. And I've asked Professor Jelks to come share with us some reflections from his recent work, Letters to Martin. And I've also asked us to have somewhat of a free-flowing conversation today about some of the themes you've read in that chapter, about some of the questions that he raises, or whatever direction you and he would like that conversation to go. We've been thinking about some of these issues of the broader Atlantic world, not only in a historical context, but in a contemporary context, which is why I thought that this particular chapter was useful, and some of the themes that Dr. Jelks has been discussing today would fit in well with our discussion here. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jelks to the platform here. And I'd ask that you be prepared to share your questions. In a moment, you'll see some links that will allow you to ask questions and to post comments via YouTube for the audience who may be watching online, and we'll interact that way. So, thank you, Dr. Jelks.
Well, it's almost evening. Good evening. Oh, y'all got to do that again. No. One more time. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah, that's better. It gets the blood and the lungs going. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here, but I'll talk to you all, about the role I occupy as a professor at the University of Kansas, the Jayhawks. We're no good in football, but we do all right in basketball. I shouldn't say that too loud. Probably some of my football players are watching. But as long as we upset Texas every once in a while, it really does the heart well to find out. I am just interested in the transatlantic world because that's the world we occupy. Even the NATO treaty talks about North America. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that world is still very much with us. It may be declining because the center of the world is no longer Europe, but the center of the world is really going back to Asia once more. Remember, Columbus was trying to find his way to Asia, and he found his way to, what we call Hispaniola or Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We found it, and not, but the world very much 500 years ago did not center on even Europe. So that changed. So the world centered on Europe and Northern Europe. But culture was considered India, the Indian principalities. There was no such place as India then. And also, of course, various spaces in China, the various emperors and empires. So with that ado, and of course, we forget that a good friend of mine named Howard French has a new book about Africa in the making of the modern world. And we forget that the world as we know it didn't quite exist like we see it today. So I suggest you all look at those kinds of, thank you. I gotta get all mic'd up here. Is that good?
That's good.
All right. So with that said, thinking about broader history is something I tried to do in the collection of essays that you all read, to put Stephen King in a broader context of what's transpiring in the world. So with that said, I'm fully want to hear what you students have to say, and I'm always I don't have a long speech, but just interested in your conversation with me. And what do you think about it? Because you very much live in a global world. When I was born, I'm a boomer. I was born in the 50s. And when I was born, it was about America. But quickly on, the world's population changed. So I'll give you one example. In 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated, the United States economically was at the pinnacle of its economic success. The car industry and all of those, do I have to step back and say, is that what you say? The car industry and all of those things, in 1968, economic historians tell us that it's really pinnacle, right? Because everything throughout Europe, World War II was destroyed, Japan destroyed. But by 1968, man, there was this cool car that they were being advertised called the Volkswagen. The Volkswagen, as really the people's wagon, right? Now that has a peculiar history in Germany, and but everybody wanted to buy one. And why? Because it was the commercials went Volkswagen for $19.95, $1,995. And the thing about the Volkswagen, just give you imagine, you could take the engine out and replace it. It was like a washing machine engine. And it was cool because in the late 60s, 70s, everybody wanted a Volkswagen. Why? It just signaled that it was a new shift. And of course, the first car I owned was a Datsun, which is the precursor to the Nissan, right? It was a little box thing, and all my friends were driving these big American cars, dunking up gas, and I could drive. I went to school in Ann Arbor at university. I could drive all over town on a buck worth of gas and look like I could go everywhere. So the thing that you have to remember is that the world was radically changing. By the 1980s, you all are born in the late 90s, maybe early part of 2000. Well, the world was radically changing right before my eyes. So the world that you belong to and the world that I belong to were two different things. When I went to school, student loans were called the National Student Defense Loan, the Cold War, right? And everybody got loans in that way, that the government and the states supplemented the education a lot more. So the world is changed. So I just really want you to think about that, and as we think about where we are today. So let's have a conversation.
So please, based on what you read or what you thought, and just pose questions, raise your hand, state your question.
Sure.
You can also post them online.
Yeah, I have a question. You made an argument in some of the earlier parts of the reading that I made a distinction between the bourgeoisie and the working class, but you made an argument that the actions of the bourgeoisie in Latin America, for example, threaten race and gender more so than class. I'd love to hear your elaborate on that and expand on that a little bit.
That's a good question. I don't even remember what I said. That's the thing about writing a book. You forget what you said. Oh my, I got to go back and read that. The whole idea of the bourgeoisie comes from Marx, right? I mean, Karl Marx. And the idea that Marx put out the bourgeoisie is that they were far more radical in the transformation by the way they use capital. And Marx describes capital as not just money. Capital is social power. that you have the power to change people. So to be a real capitalist in Marx's sense is, if I see a house that I want to buy, that's a little raggedy shack, I can buy that house and sit on it for 20 years. Now, most of us who buy a raggedy shack of a house gotta make some money off of it very quickly. You're not a real capitalist, Marx would say. Because real capitalists have generational kind of capital. So generational capital, money long term. And so what I was trying to say is that even in the communist revolution, Marx would have been surprised by the communist revolution in 1917, because he thought that kind of revolution would come through a capitalist society. Russia, by all means, was an agrarian society, like parts of the South, right? An agrarian society built on mass farms, serfdom. And serfdom ended roughly, about 40 years before American slavery. So nobody would have been completely surprised, caught off guard, that a, quote, communist. What was interesting is then the Russians had to go out and build an industrial society, a collective kind of industrial society to keep up. So my point was that I think I was trying to say in that letter is that this was then a mass shift between two different sets of ideologies about what would be fairness, what would be goodness on either side. Would individualism be good, or would collectivism be good? And of course, we entered it in a long, protracted dance that almost destroyed the world over that. I hope that answers.
Yes, sir.
Sorry to be too long.
So in the book, I have a quote from it. Love must guide our political conflicts, choices, philosophies, and strategies. Do you think we need that more today, or did we need that more back then when Marx?
Well, I also say in the book that it's a kind of, it's more easy to mobilize hate, right? I mean, hatred is a thing that has fueled human societies forever. So it's kind of dreamy of me to think that love can do that. But I think that we at least have to have it as a consideration, right? That we have to have it as an ethical consideration. What's the alternative? The alternative is if we saw everybody as an enemy, we'd just be, mowing down everybody, right? And with democracy, what I'm ultimately getting at, democracy doesn't ask us to like everybody, because you can't really do that. But it does ask us through legal protections to protect everybody. And sometimes protect everybody from one another, right? I mean, we do have crazy people out here, but what are the measures by which we protect people? And that's what I was trying to get at in that. And ultimately, love is the respect of neighbor as self, the golden rule, as it's called. Yes, sir.
You have a question online from Sunny Souls. Why another book about MLK? Is there any lesser known activists that you would like to shine a light on?
Oh, well, there should be books about everybody. I just figured this is my turn to interject my view on MLK and use MLK as a way to talking to y'all. That's what I really wanted to do. But nobody ever asked that question about Lincoln. And as I said earlier today, there's been more ink than blood spilled on Lincoln. I mean, every week, I'm a journal editor. I see a new book on Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln gets, and how many books we have on George Washington? So yeah, and King should, and his cohort should have books, and there are books coming out. My friend Keisha Blaine has a book of Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'm all for it. All of these books should come out, because these are really great and interesting people. I mean, sharecropper woman organizing and getting all the way to the Democratic Convention. That's a pretty great story. And differed with Dr. King. That's the beauty of the civil rights movement. People didn't always agree. And but they had similar aims in mind. Yes.
You mentioned demonstrations of U.S. power used the lessons learned from anti-Black, Brown, Native, and Asian racism to make apartheid globally palatable. Which lessons do you think were learned from racism that made apartheid palatable?
Well, the South Africans clearly learned from the U.S. and they'll tell you that. I mean, I've been to South Africa on a couple of occasions, and they'll tell you, "Oh, well, it worked in the United States." It's just like Hitler said, "Oh, well, I saw the Armenian genocide." He said, "Oh, that works." Politicians are they're not original. They're like, "Oh, that works," but what moral consideration would you give to wipe out people, right? Because with the Armenian genocide, just I'm using this as an example. Well, nobody will remember this, or what happened among indigenous people. Well, nobody will remember this. The laws put down in the South, there were actual laws. I mean, Jim Crow was a set of rules, and it wasn't just about Black people. In 1882, the U.S. Congress did something very interesting. They passed this Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was done as a compromise between Western and Southern legislators to get over. So you see these intersecting kind of relationships, and people learn from that because, right? I mean, politicians say, "Oh, that Austrian guy, oh, he just did something great." And, I'm like, "No, that wasn't great at all. You shouldn't even be thinking about that. That doesn't fit us." But that's how people think. And everybody thinks, "Well, Bill Gates did it, I will, do it too." Or Jeff Bezos did it, I'll do it too. But without consideration of at what cost and to whom. And does that fit in with we think is democratic realities? Right? Questions? Yes, sir.
So, I don't know if you mentioned this before, but like, what's the background story into you writing letters to them? Like, what's the whole story with that?
What's the whole story with that? I went to another school, just like I'm at this school, right? I went to, it's called Elmhurst University, just outside Chicago. And I had to talk I was invited on the MLK Day, invite the Black professor on MLK Day. And so I went on MLK Day, and it was a good friend of mine who invited me, who teaches there. And I disagreed with the election of the former president. I mean, I disagreed with the president, not the election, because under the law, it was right that you win the electoral college, you win the election. But I disagree with the former president, and that is our right. That's the beauty in the United States. I've been in countries where you can't disagree with the government. Now, I actually have been in countries, and if you do, there's going to be somebody sneaking at your house, and you're going to be taken out at night, and might not be seen for a long time, maybe never. So I disagreed, and I thought the language that the former president used was dispiriting to a lot of different groups of people. So I wanted to say something what I thought was hopeful, and that was that democratic struggle is always a struggle. So, for example, when the country started, only elite rich white men, while home of property owning, remember Marx talked about those bourgeois, right? I mean, they are the future bourgeois. Own property, and nobody else can vote. Women are not coded humanity. enslaved people certainly are, the indigenous are being thought about to be pushed out. And even white males couldn't vote. So that comes in the 1830s under Jacksonian, in Jacksonian America. And then, I mean, local states have different rules, but we wouldn't call them necessarily progressive by any measure of or inclusive by any stretch of the imagination. So to understand that long history, that long arc, is that the Civil War, which we are in Kennesaw, right at the battlefield, that long arc forces a new inclusion in the country. We get the 14th Amendment, which says anybody born in the United States is a citizen. Remember, most people of African descent weren't citizens, even though they were probably more American than anybody. I'm a Louisianan, and I know I'm more American than most people sitting in this room, right? 18th century, I can trace a lineage to the 18th century. But that didn't mean I had the right to participate. My ancestors certainly didn't have the right to participate. And some of your ancestors didn't have the right to participate in governing, because that's the whole premise of our government, that we have the right to self-govern. We have the right to elect our representatives. We have the right to not like each other, but we all have the responsibility by law to respect each other. Women don't get the right till the 1920s. I mean, and that's still not really right. It's not till the 1960s that we started coining full citizenship to people. And that's what I wanted to get over to the generation in a way that was readable, that was literary, and that you're in a constant struggle. Like, I was born into a struggle. I didn't ask to be. It's like if you're immigrant, you swear, when you get naturalized citizen, you swear to uphold the Constitution. If you ever gone to a service, it's very beautiful and very moving, actually. And you swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States, right? Most of us don't even think about it. So I wanted ways to target what Martin Luther King was trying to do as a broader question of who gets to participate, and as a voice in that struggle.
I have a comment that I'm going to make that I hope will provoke some more questions. As I was talking with Professor Jelks a little earlier today, I was telling him this is only the third or fourth class that we've had. We're just getting started. We haven't done much in here, but one of the films that we watched was Exterminate All the Brutes, which is a film by Raoul Peck, who's a Haitian, he takes on Western history in general, and he looks at some major themes. One of them is fascism, and the other part of it is history. And he's looking at the politics of how we write history, about the whole kind of Western project since the 1400s to the present, and how erasure of people from those histories influences how people see themselves, their right, so to speak, to ownership of the world and its resources, etc. So one of the things that I've been hopeful of doing over the course of this semester is getting students to think about the politics of history writing itself. Because for many students in this room, perhaps they were raised with the idea that history is often some objective space, and it should be above the fray of politics, or it has no politics at all. And part of the objective was to get them to think about how those politics have become so ingrained in the narratives that we often fail to even raise the questions, because we just make general assumptions. I wanted to ask for you to give some of your thoughts on the politics within history, but also just advice. Most of the students in here are seniors, they're history majors or history education majors. So what would be some of your advice as they're beginning this semester. For some of them, it's their last semester, and for others not, but they're definitely beginning to look towards becoming history educators.
Well, the thing that way we interpret history, and I don't think it's just the United States, right? No country wants to tell their dirty lie. Remarkably, the Germans have done a good job, right? I mean, remarkably. But the Japanese, for example, still won't fess up to what went on in Korea, right? And that's a source of tension, right? The Japanese never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like they did in South Africa, right? And it's still a source of tension, right? And it's or what happened in China. This is all sorts of tensions, right? Because there are senses of history is never kind of fixed, because one people's history is another. In my dedication of the book, I have my dissertation advisor as one of the people. She taught me as a woman about Black women's history, which was neglected. Women get neglected all over the place, right? That's a silence in history, right? We want to tell the great heroes, a male, and most of those were warriors. But what about all of those women? Jesus and the disciples, but they had to eat. Who was feeding them? Right? All those women, right? They went to the wedding at Canaan where Jesus, turned water into wine. It was a party. Who was throwing the party? So all of those stories, what I'm saying to you is history is never fixed. It's a debatable subject. And where we treat is, we treat history as this, and this. And that's completely boring to students, by the way. It's just totally boring, right? History is more like a soap opera. Imagine, I had competitive aunts. And if you'd have gave them an army, oh Lord, right? Imagine your competitive aunts with an army. Because they use the children. Well, my child is doing this, my child is doing that. Now give them an army. I got the biggest army, I'll tell you what. Well, that's partly what history is about, right? Human frailty, jealousies, other kinds of things. And there are always the ways of telling history. The history of labor just in the South. There were white sharecroppers and black sharecroppers. What happened when they tried to organize? That's a labor question. And then becomes labor and race, right? So there are a variety of ways to tell history, and as long as you get people interested in it. I love this. I taught in Grand Rapids, Michigan for a long time, but I worked with a school that was supposed to be bad. And I would take the bad kids to the public library, the bad kids. And I said to them, I can tell you something about your house. They didn't know anything of research tools, right? So I started pulling out Pope directories from towns, right? And I said, what's your address in the city? I said, well, one time a doctor lived in your house. And the kid goes, what? And then this library had, through the archives, it had old real estate. How much the house sold for one time, next generation. Suddenly these kids are like into it. Because it's history, right? It's living, moving, and it's still moving, right? 2 or 3, 4 kids took their parents back to the library because they got into it so much. So history is alive and well, and it's all how you teach it, right? If you teach it from your aunt's perspective, you might have war. If you teach it from, all of those things are part of history, and it's an interpretation. I grew up not far from Lee Circle in New Orleans. At 9 years old, I had the temerity to walk up to the statue and look at what it said. It said dedicated to white supremacy. No, I'm not making this up. And because, why? That was a form of way of telling history. History is always about power, right? In Rome, we learned about the Romans, but we never learned about the Etruscans. Those were the people before the Romans. Yeah, they got kind of buried under there, right? Well, what the Romans learned from the Etruscans. And of course, the Romans, like you know, those Greek gods are really good. Let's just give them other names. We're gonna call, you know, Apollo, you know, we're gonna it's like you get that memory. People do that in history. That's a way of power. But that's not about truth. That's a way of power. And power and truth are two different things at that time, right? And so, right? Indigenous people all around. What was learned from the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the homeless, all of those people are all around. You know, we take what we want. That's power. Because nations are about power. You just got to remember that. There's no nation is not about power, right? I mean, that collectivity we call a nation, or you know, later on we call a nation state. That's about power, right? I plant the flag for Spain. You know, boom. You know, put the like. Well, even in the history of slavery, there were other powers, right? The Portuguese, when they came to what is they built a warehouse fortress called Saint Jorge da Almina, Saint George of the Mine. But they had to negotiate with the Fanti and Central Coast African kings, and they paid rent for 200 years, and then you know the Dutch came over and fought them to get that because that was expansion. You see, the way we tell the story is that although everybody just conquered people and they just willingly submitted to being conquered, no, nobody really submits to being conquered. You know, it's a long fight. It wasn't, Europeans didn't really have dominance in Africa until the Maxim gun came along. High repeating gun. You know, spears are just as dangerous as guns. And if you know how to throw one right, ask the Portuguese. There's famous stories in Portuguese. The ship was coming, they're shooting the cannons. The cannons weren't that accurate. And canoemen are in these canoes and wiping out Portuguese sailors. The Portuguese, well, we got to negotiate this now. Right? We got enough, you know. And you got to pay rent. So when the Portuguese are looking for gold, they discover slaves. That's it. Why? Because sugarcane is coming on. And sugarcane comes into the Madeira Islands and other places. But nations want to tell stories of power and glory. Historians, we kind of those messy people. It really wasn't like that. You know, Betsy Ross really wasn't like that. I'm sorry. And then everybody gets mad at you, right? They get mad at you. Even in local history. My first book was about a local town, right? It was a famous civil rights case. There was a lawyer who was said to have done that case over and over again. So, you know, go to the archives, I go to the court records, I start going through dusty books from the 1920s, discovered the lawyer's name is nowhere in it. It's another attorney. He gets killed in a car accident. That's even a local. Now I got a scandal on my hand, right? Because the family, the local family, has lived in that lore and that luxury forever. Here I am, the historian, going, well, your grandfather really didn't handle that case. I know he said he did, but here's the other lawyer, and here's the court records, and you know, And I'm sorry to steal the thunder. But that's how history is. Because once you start going to the records, you go, oh, that's a little more complicated than I thought. And that's what you have to, if you're going to tell the history of the state as all true and meaningful without the politics, then yeah, you go with that. But if you're telling the history that you discover from the being sneezing in archives from dust and mites and all that other stuff, that's a different thing. And that's where, because all people want to keep silences, right? Dudes don't ever want to say what they did to women, period, across the world. Right? Monarchs don't ever want to say what they did to their enemies. So I think silences are a part of history, and we reproduce this, right? And it goes on. So you need to kind of evaluate the sources. That's why we beat you up about sources, source. We beat you up to go, you got to go dig up in the sources. Go read something. And even the archives. Archives are sometimes designed to lend support to the traditional story. But then you discover in those archives, wait a minute, there's some other stories. Last story about a local community, this community in Grand Rapids, I did this legal case. And I could not find about this legal case anything in a newspaper. I couldn't find a thing. I kept wondering, but the case took place. I got court records. Why it didn't appear in the newspaper? It was against a famous entertainment corporation in the 1920s that did a lot of advertisement in the mainstream press. I discovered in a black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, all about the case, but not the daily that ran in the town, because they had interest in keeping the advertising dollars up. That's what you discover. There are all kinds of ways people create silences. Yes?
So after a string like that, I hate to divert.
No.
The chapter that we were assigned to read in your book was very structured as a timeline running parallel to Dr. King's life.
Yes.
It went from Toussaint Louverture to Woodrow Wilson, World War I, and onwards all the way up to Vietnam. Why did you structure the chapter in that manner? Why would you have it, running every so often, you introduce a new period in history, and it's like, you were this old, you were doing this. Why did you structure it like that?
Because I wanted to put him in the context, right? We all born in the context. I was born in 1956. In 1956, the Hungarians were protesting against the Russians. So if you went to the newspaper and found out that the year you were born, what was going on, then you would see a variety of things. And I wanted to sort of say that nobody's born outside of a context, a bigger context of social, global movements coming around them. They may not experience it immediately in their senses, but you are born in a context, and you are then having to deal with that bigger context way before you were born. None of y'all were born in Vietnam, right? No. I had to register for the draft. Now, luckily, if I'd been 2 years earlier, older, I might have gone in the army. But 72, into 72, they stopped the draft. They really stopped taking people. And then, but I was born when I was in high school, my senior year, when all the Watergate hearings were going on. So that's a part of my context. So I have live memories, my Mr. White, my history teacher, rolling a television. We had a television on a big car, rolling the television and we sitting there and watching it. Now, I went to high school in Chicago, and what's very important here is that in Illinois, you have to take the Constitution test to graduate from high school. Land of Lincoln back in those days, and they stopped it, right? But to graduate from high school, you have to take the U.S. Constitution test. I still think that's a good thing because it forced you to read the Constitution. And so my history teacher could use that moment. What are the Constitution? He was a dull kind of guy. What was the constitutional issues here, class? And here we were watching a congressional hearing about Watergate and people giving arguments. That's a part of my context. That's what I'm trying to say. And all of this was a part of King's context. And by 29, when he was born, January, October, the Great Depression comes along. So, and all the things he's got to be engaged in, called a communist. Why is it called a communist? 1917, communist revolution, right? Anybody who was called, like, if you got called a communist in the South, that's like being called a rapist. Right? People are like, oh, it's a communist, godless, and then they always got to put godless communist. You can't be a God-fearing communist. You got to be a godless communist. And so all of those are then things that you have to respond to in ways you craft, protest, and other things. And that's what I wanted people to get at. And the world house that he was born to was different. And by the time he died, we were then in the thick of a war in Southeast Asia. We had been in a war in Korea, which my father was in, right? And people often forget the Korean War matched the Vietnam War, North-South battle over quote unquote communism, over and now all of us are buying stuff made in Vietnam, so the ways that these were framed shaped his life. That's what I was trying to get at. And just like my life is shaped by Watergate, and I was telling your good professor that is shaped by the change in you've seen the U.S. change from an industrial economy to a service economy. Yes.
Towards the end of the reading, you made allusion to FDR's For Freedom speech that was written in 1941, but in 36, after the Olympics, he had kind of cast aside and disregarded the black athletes, including Jesse Owens, as well as at the end of 41, signing Executive Order 9866 and establishing the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast. Did either of those events factor into your decision to include that speech, and do you think that diminishes the point of?
Well, the speech is a brilliant speech. I still think it's one of the great political speeches in American history. It's a brilliant speech. Politicians don't always live up to, as Dr. King would say, democratic creeds, but it was a brilliant speech. And it is a noble aspiration. And we should continue, everybody should read that speech. You should have kids read that speech. It's a brilliant speech. Huh? But then you have to be forced. Politicians are often forced to do things. That's what protest is about. They don't often want to do it. Look, A. Philip Randolph forced the president at the threat of a march on Washington to give an executive order, that anybody with a government contract, they had to hire everybody. I gave black laborers a boom. So people went, this caused a great migration. People, my family from Louisiana, some of them went to California, to Oakland, to work the docks, which they had done in New Orleans. So that was a boom. So, but that wasn't because like FDR, he had to deal with Southern congressmen. So, there's a give and take. Much of the talk about even voting rights means that people forget that FDR had a hard time. domestic workers weren't included in Social Security Act. Farm workers weren't included in Social Security Act. It was only till Lyndon Johnson that they were included in that Great Society program. So it's a struggle because you have entrenched powers. Now you might decide which side you're on in the power struggle, and that's cool. I know some very rich, mega rich people, and they know which side I'm on, and I know which side they are, and we disagree. And I really do know mega rich people, and they know which side I'm on. It's advertised. It's in my writings. It's in my op-ed pieces that I've written. I ain't mad at you. It ain't personal to me, but we disagree. Do I think that working people need more support? Yes. Do I think students need more support? Yes. And no, we disagree. Not everything can be done for money. A public museum can't be done for money. It don't make no money, but it's a good. It's a good, right? So sometimes, we gotta disagree. That's democracy. I don't mind. Now, you might have more influence over me because you got a lot of money. And people with a lot of money got a lot of power. That's what Marx said. That's his whole idea. You got a lot of power. But I figure people who organize got a lot of power. Well, we don't have no money, but we got numbers. Hence the Voting Rights Act. Because people with entrenched interest, look, if I had a lot of money, if I was born with a lot of money, I might be on the same side as them. Seriously. I'm willing to, because I see people in all kinds of situations trying to protect interests. And I'm like, even in academics are worse because it's so freaking stupid. Right? They're trying to protect interests. Like, yeah, man, dude, this is not all that. I just want you to know, it ain't all that. Right? This is what it is that people want to protect some kind of entrenched power, whether it's in a synagogue, a mosque, a church. I've seen all kinds of ways people try to protect their power base. I'm like, that's interesting. Is it really worth that? What is it that we're trying to control? Now, that's when you have to ask my mega rich friends, what y'all trying to control here? Why you think you are more morally superior than other people? I don't know. As my granny would say, everybody put on their drawers the same way, one leg at a time. Or maybe some of y'all jump on them, I don't know. Yes.
I was wondering if, while you're writing this, did you ever think of how MLK was responding?
No. But that's a great question. I think he would have liked it. Actually, really, I do. Because he's a very reflective person. And a very introspective person. So I think he would have liked it, he might disagree with some of the ways I frame things. But I wanted to write something, letters are intimate. So, you get close to people when you write a letter. Y'all be texting and swiping and stuff. I watch my daughter. I'm trying to go on a date, Dad. I mean, that's how y'all do things nowadays, right? I have no idea, because, when I was, when dinosaurs roamed when I was in school, you sat next to somebody and you say, oh, you look like a nice person. Would you like to have some coffee after class, or you'd like to, just chat or something like that now? Y'all be swiping, and I've learned all the, for my students, I've learned all about Bumble, Tinder, whatever, all of the whole 9 yards. I'm like, Grindr. I'm like, whoa, That's the beauty of teaching college. I mean, I actually gave extra credit if they taught me about social media because I just I had to keep up because I had to ask my teachers and assistants, like, what's the humor nowadays? I once mentioned something about the Matrix, right? And the whole class was silent. And I was like, okay, that ain't working. So I had to keep asking my teaching assistant, y'all closer to these people than I am. What's up? The intimacy, that's what I really want to get at. And to letters made me think of more humanity. And I began the book with, I was 13 and my uncle had a book and it had a picture of Dr. King smoking. But he was slumped over and utterly exhausted in the airport, I think it's Montgomery or Birmingham. I forget which airport it was in. He and Andrew Young. And he never wanted to be photographed with a cigarette in his hand. He was a Baptist, Baptists, y'all don't, if any of y'all Baptists, y'all know y'all don't want to be caught smoking or drinking in public. But you might do it in the side, especially Methodists, boy. Y'all don't want to be caught. But he's utterly exhausted. And he has a cigarette in his hand. And it was striking to me even at 13. I was like, this man is really human. It's a price to be paid. Remember, he was 26 when he started. And 13 years later, he looks like he's 66 because he's just utterly worn out. And the physicality of being in democratic struggle, I just wanted to make that humanity, and that letters seemed to me real human. I would tell Dr. King, I should have wrote a letter. Dr. King, please take a vacation. You need a vacation. You need to just sit you need to sit on one of them islands for about a month and a half, 2 months. Don't call me, I'll call you when I'm ready. That's what I would have told him, because you follow his actual schedule. It's utterly exhausting. He really wasn't home a whole lot. He was always on the road. That's terrible. Yes.
So in your book, you talked about the boycotts where they say, don't buy where you can't work.
Mm-hmm.
So
in the 30s.
Mm-hmm. What were the effects of those boycotts?
Well, those were all local, right? I mean, so those don't buy where you can't work happened not in the South, but in New York and Washington, D.C. And those were all local. People, local action, believe it or not, winds up becoming national action sooner or later. So all those boycotts were the precursors to finally it galvanizes it into a snowball. Yes.
Like someone pointed out earlier in a question, you frame throughout this section, the World House, you frame it as sort of like a narrative, like a timeline. And near the very end of it, you start talking about the sort of issues that we face today, things like climate issues, things that disproportionately affect the global South and non-white communities, often poor communities. In some ways, things have gotten better, and in other ways, you say, you point out that they've gotten better, and then in other ways, they've sort of stayed the same. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, with changes having happened in the past, despite taking time, and like you said, the democratic struggle is always a struggle, do you think those things will get better with time?
Well, I mean, only if we make them better. That's what I think the lesson of Dr. King is, that we have to get out and make the world better. When I entered high school was the first year of Earth Day, right? We knew already that what was going to happen with climate issues. We actually known this for the last 80 years. We've known what this is like. How do you get it over to people, right? Because you got a lot of distractions anyway. On Dr. King Day, buy a new Maytag washing machine. I mean, you got a lot of distractions to not think about this. But all things are local. And as I said to the group earlier today, you got climate change right here on campus. You thought about water runoff. Or you thought about over-fertilizing the grass.